The space station known as Veyrisma was not a place where good things happened, and everyone who lived there knew it well enough to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. It was built inside a hollowed-out asteroid that floated in the dark space between two dead star systems, far from any law, far from any flag, far from anything that resembled order or justice. Pirates came here to spend their stolen credits. Smugglers came here to trade in forbidden cargo. And killers came here to find work. And on this particular night, the most dangerous killer in 47 star systems had just stepped off a transport shuttle and was walking through the rusted corridors like a shadow made of sharp edges and cold purpose. His name was Kale Giron. He was a Drafin, a species that the rest of the galaxy feared in a way that went beyond simple terror and settled somewhere deep in the bone, in that ancient part of every living creature's brain that screamed, "Run," when something with too many limbs moved too fast in the dark. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, his body covered in dark scales that shifted color depending on the light. 4 muscular arms folded behind his back as he walked, and his eyes, 2 primary and 2 secondary, glowed a faint amber in the dim corridor light. Kale was a Void Fang. That title meant something in every corner of the galaxy, in every language, on every world that had ever heard the name Drathan. It meant that he was one of only 12 assassins alive who had reached the highest rank of the ancient killing order, a rank earned not through tests or ceremonies, but through a simple and brutal truth: he had never failed a contract. Not once in 214 kills across 3 decades of work had Kale Giron failed to end the life he was paid to end. He moved through Veyrisma without hurry, and the crowds parted for him the way water parts around a blade. They recognized him specifically, but because every species in the galaxy carried an instinct about Drathan, you did not stand in their path, you did not meet their eyes, and you certainly did not speak to them unless spoken to first. He reached a heavy door at the end of a corridor that smelled of engine grease and alien sweat, and he pressed his palm to the scanner beside it. The door opened with a hiss, and Kale stepped inside. The room beyond was expensive, the kind of expensive that tried very hard to look modest, but failed, because everything in it was made from materials that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Sitting at the far end of a long table was the client. It was a Yenthari Archon, a tall, thin creature with an exoskeleton that shimmered like polished pearl, multifaceted eyes that reflected the dim light like clusters of tiny diamonds, and long, delicate limbs that clicked softly against the tabletop as Kale entered. Yenthari were an old species, much older than the Drathan, and they had once ruled a vast empire that stretched across hundreds of systems. But those days were long gone, and now the Yenthari clung to whatever power they could buy, bribe, or steal, their pride far larger than their fading influence. "You are the Void Fang," the Archon said, and its voice was a layered thing, like 3 voices speaking at slightly different speeds. Kale did not sit down. He never sat during contract discussions, because sitting implied equality, and Kale considered himself equal to very few beings in the universe. "I am," he replied, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the chest of anyone who heard it. "I have a contract for you," the Archon said, sliding a thin data tablet across the polished table surface. "The payment is 9 galactic standard fortunes, transferred upon confirmation of the kill." Kale's secondary eyes blinked, a Drathan expression of surprise most species could not read. 9 fortunes was an absurd sum, the kind of money that could purchase a small moon or fund a private fleet. It was the kind of money that was only offered when the target was either extremely dangerous or extremely important. He picked up the tablet with one of his lower hands and activated it. The file was thin, far thinner than any contract dossier he had ever received. A name appeared on the screen: Commander Jonah Marin, Species: human. Assignment: military attaché, Helix Point Diplomatic Station. Threat classification: unclassified. Kale stared at the screen for a long moment. And then he did something that he rarely did during professional meetings. He laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, like stones cracking against each other, and it made the Archon flinch slightly in its seat. "A human," Kale said, and there was genuine amusement in his voice. Not cruelty, just the honest surprise of a predator being asked to hunt something it considered beneath its notice. Humans were a young species, barely 300 years into their spacefaring existence, which was nothing compared to the thousands of years most galactic civilizations had been traveling between stars. They were soft-bodied, slow by galactic standards, fragile in ways that made most other species wonder how they had survived on their own world long enough to develop technology at all. They had no natural armor, no venom, no claws worth mentioning, no ability to see in the dark, or survive in vacuum, or regenerate lost limbs. They were by every measurable standard that the Assassin Guild used to evaluate threat levels, utterly unremarkable. The unclassified tag on the dossier simply meant that no Drathan had ever been contracted to kill a human before, and therefore no threat data existed, which to Kale was the same as saying the threat was zero. "Me to kill a human," Kale said, and he let the disbelief hang in the air between them like smoke. The Archon's multifaceted eyes shifted, a subtle movement that Kale read as discomfort. "Commander Marin is interfering with operations that are vital to Yenthari interests on Helix Point," the Archon said carefully. "He has disrupted 3 of our intelligence networks in the past standard year, and has become an obstacle that cannot be removed through political means." "So remove him through cheaper means," Kale said. "A human does not require a void fang. Hire a local contractor, a poisoner, a back-alley knife for a fraction of this price." The Archon's limbs clicked against the table again, faster this time, a sign of agitation. "We have tried," the Archon admitted, and something in its layered voice shifted into a register that Kale recognized after decades of reading the emotions of alien species. It was fear. "We sent 2 operatives in the past 6 months," the Archon continued. "Neither returned and no trace of them was found. No bodies, no signals, no evidence that they ever arrived on Helix Point at all." Kale's amber eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time since entering the room, he gave the contract his full attention. 2 operatives vanishing without a trace was unusual, but not necessarily alarming. There could be 100 explanations, most of them having nothing to do with the target himself. Still, it added a small wrinkle of interest to what had seemed like a tediously simple job. "Who were the operatives?" Kale asked. "A Valesi infiltrator and a Kreth hunter scout," the Archon replied. Kale considered this. The Valesi were clever but physically weak, and the Kreth were strong but loud and clumsy in close quarters. Neither was in the same universe of capability as a Drathan Voidfang, and their failure told him nothing meaningful about the target. The dossier photo one more time. Jonah Marin stared back at him from the screen, a human male of middle years, with short dark hair going gray at the sides, a strong jaw, and eyes that were a flat, steady brown. And there was something in those eyes that Kale could not quite name, something that sat behind the calmness, like a large animal resting in tall grass. But Kale dismissed it as his imagination playing tricks. He had been in this business too long, and sometimes the mind invented threats where none existed, especially when the money was suspiciously high. "I accept the contract," Kale said, placing the tablet back on the table. The Archon's pearl-colored exoskeleton seemed to relax, and its clicking limbs slowed. "Excellent. How long will you need?" Kale was already turning toward the door. "I will be on Helix Point within 2 standard days," he said. "Your human will be dead within 4. He walked out of the room without looking back, his 4 arms loose at his sides, his stride unhurried and absolutely certain, because Kale Shiran had killed 214 beings across the galaxy, and not one of them had ever seen him coming until it was far too late. A human would be no different. He was sure of it. Helix Point was one of the most beautiful stations in the known galaxy. And even Kale, who cared nothing for beauty and saw the universe as little more than a series of hunting grounds connected by hyperspace lanes, had to admit that the architects had done something impressive. The station was shaped like an enormous ring, slowly spinning around a central hub, orbiting a pair of binary stars that painted everything in shifting shades of gold and violet. Thousands of beings from hundreds of species lived and worked here. Diplomats, traders, scientists, military attachés from a dozen different governments, all of them existing in a carefully maintained state of neutrality that made Helix Point one of the few places in the galaxy where sworn enemies could stand in the same room without killing each other. It was also, Kale noted as he stepped off his shuttle and into the arrivals hall, an excellent place to commit a murder, because neutral stations had neutral security, which meant the guards were trained to keep the peace, not to hunt shadows, and shadows were where Kale lived. He arrived under a cover identity that his guild had prepared for him, a Drathan trade liaison named Vesk Tarani, here to negotiate mineral export contracts with a Helix Point trading consortium. And the station security officers barely glanced at his documentation before waving him through. Drathan were feared, yes, but they were also respected as traders and diplomats, and not every member of their species was an assassin, though more of them were than the galaxy liked to think about. Kale settled into his assigned quarters, a modest but comfortable suite in the station's visitor wing, and immediately began his work. He did not rush. He never rushed, because rushing was how assassins made mistakes, and mistakes were how assassins died. For 3 full station days, he studied his target. He hacked into the station's internal monitoring system using a Drathan codebreaker that could have cracked a military-grade encryption network in under a minute. And Helix Point's civilian systems folded open for him like paper. He watched Commander Jonah Marin through security feeds and corridor cameras, tracking every movement the human made from the moment he woke to the moment he returned to his quarters at night. The man's routine was almost boring in its simplicity. Marin woke at 0600 station time every morning and exercised in his quarters for exactly 30 minutes, push-ups, pull-ups, and a series of stretches that Kale did not recognize from any known combat discipline. At 0700, he walked to the observation lounge on Deck 12 and drank a cup of a hot black liquid that the station database identified as coffee, a human beverage made from roasted plant seeds that contained a chemical compound called caffeine, which was technically a neurotoxin. Kale found this mildly interesting. Humans willingly consumed poison every morning as part of their daily routine, which was either impressive or insane, and he suspected it was both. After coffee, Marin spent his days moving between the human embassy wing and various meetings with other species representatives, and his evenings were spent in the common areas, playing card games with station maintenance workers, talking with cooks and engineers and janitors, laughing at jokes that Kale could not hear through the security cameras, but could see from the way Marin's shoulders shook and his eyes creased at the corners. He was, by every outward appearance, a completely ordinary and unremarkable man. But Kale was not an ordinary observer. He was a predator who had spent 30 years studying the way living things moved, and he began to notice details about Jonah Marin that did not fit the profile of a soft, fragile, unremarkable species. The first thing he noticed was that Marin never sat with his back to a door. Not once in 3 days of observation, not in the lounge, not in meeting rooms, not even in the mess hall, where the only entrance was 20 meters away. This was not a conscious decision. Kale could tell from the way Marin moved that it was automatic. Something burned so deep into his behavior that he probably did not even know he was doing it. And it was a habit that Kale recognized because he had the exact same one. The second thing was Marin's eyes. Even when he was laughing and relaxed and seemingly paying no attention to anything but his card game or his conversation, his eyes moved, tracking reflections in windows, following motion in polished wall panels, registering every being that entered or exited a room. Kale had seen this behavior before, in Drathan hunters, in Kreth war chiefs, in the rare few individuals from any species who had been shaped by real violence into something that was never truly at rest. Happened on the second day of surveillance. Marin was walking through a cargo corridor when a loader drone behind him dropped a heavy metal crate with a crash that echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Every alien in the corridor flinched. The Velesi diplomat jumped sideways. The Kreth guards reached for their weapons. Even a pair of Drathan traders stiffened visibly. Marin did not flinch. He turned, not spun, not jerked, just turned. And he was already balanced when he faced the sound, his weight centered, his hands open and loose at his sides, his brown eyes flat and focused. It lasted maybe 2 seconds before he saw the dropped crate, nodded to the embarrassed loader operator, and walked on as if nothing had happened. But Kale had watched those 2 seconds very carefully from his hidden camera feed, and what he saw made something old and sharp stir in the back of his predator brain. That was not a reaction. That was a readiness that had never switched off. Kale pushed the thought aside and returned to his planning. He was overthinking this. Humans were soft. Everyone knew it, and the fact that this particular human had good situational awareness did not change the fundamental biological reality that Drathan were faster, stronger, and deadlier in every measurable way. He selected his weapon, his personal phase blade, a Drathan masterwork that vibrated at a molecular frequency and could cut through starship hull plating like a finger through smoke. He would enter Marin's quarters during the deep sleep cycle at 0300 station time, when human biology was at its lowest point of alertness, and he would deliver a single void arc strike, a killing blow that moved faster than most species could perceive, a technique that had ended over 200 lives and had never once been blocked, dodged, or survived. It would be quick, clean, and professional. On the third night, at exactly 0247 station time, Kale left his quarters. He moved through the maintenance tunnels that ran behind the station's walls, tunnels that he had mapped completely during his 3 days of preparation. And he made no sound at all, because Drathan could control every muscle in their body independently. And when a Void Fang chose to be silent, even the air did not know he was there. He reached the door to Marin's quarters at 0259. The lock was a standard civilian model, and Kale's codebreaker opened it in under 2 seconds with a soft click that was quieter than a heartbeat. The door slid open. The room beyond was dark, not perfectly dark, because the binary stars outside the viewport cast thin ribbons of gold and violet light across the floor, but dark enough that a human's limited eyes would see nothing. Kale's 4 eyes saw everything. He saw the small quarters, a bed against the far wall, a desk, a chair, a closet, a door to a washroom, of Jonah Marin lying on the bed, his breathing slow and steady in the rhythm of deep sleep. Kale drew his phase blade. The weapon hummed to life in his primary right hand, vibrating at a frequency that made the light around it bend and shimmer. And the sound it made was so high-pitched that only Drathan ears could hear it. A thin, singing whine, like a wire about to snap. He crossed the room in 3 strides, each one perfectly silent, his 4 arms positioned in the opening form of the void arc. Primary right hand raised with the blade, primary left hand extended for balance. Both lower hands ready to block any desperate defensive movement from the target. He reached the bedside. He looked down at the sleeping human, soft skin, closed eyes, slow breathing, completely vulnerable, completely unaware. Kale brought the phase blade down. It was the 215th kill of his career, and it should have been the easiest. A sleeping, unarmed, unarmored human, with no combat classification and no threat rating, lying helpless in his bed in the dark. The blades screamed through the air in a perfect void arc, moving at a speed that would have been invisible to any camera and imperceptible to any nervous system slower than a Draythan's own. And then a hand came up out of the darkness and closed around Cale's wrist like a steel trap. Not the blade, the wrist. Cale's entire body locked in a way that it had never locked before, every muscle freezing at once, because his brain simply could not process what was happening. Because in 3 decades and 214 kills across 47 star systems, nothing alive had ever touched him during a void arc. The hand that held his wrist was human, 5 fingers, soft skin, no claws, no armor, no augmentation, and it was squeezing with a force that made Cale's silicon-reinforced wrist bones groan and creak like a ship under pressure. 4 eyes locked onto the face below him. Jonah Marin's brown eyes were open, and they were not the eyes of a man who had just been startled from sleep. They were the eyes of a man who had been waiting. "You should have read a longer file," Marin said, and his voice was calm and low and steady, like a man commenting on the weather. And in that voice, Cale heard something that his predator brain recognized with a jolt of pure, primal alarm. The absolute confidence of a creature that knew exactly what it was. What happened next took 9 seconds. In the first second, Marin twisted his body off the bed with an explosive motion that used Cale's own downward momentum against him, redirecting the phase blade away from his body and pulling the Draythan assassin off balance for the first time in his adult life. In the second second, Cale recovered, because he was still a Void Fang, still one of the 12 deadliest beings alive, and he lashed out with his primary left arm in a venom strike aimed at Marin's throat, a blow that carried enough neurotoxin to kill a Kreth warbeast in 4 heartbeats. Marin did not dodge the strike. He redirected it, catching Cale's forearm with his free hand and turning the momentum sideways so that the venomed claws scraped harmlessly along the wall, gouging deep scratches in the metal. In the third and fourth seconds, Cale realized that this human was reading his movements, not predicting them, not guessing, but reading them in real time, processing the tiny shifts in Cale's muscle tension and joint angles and weight distribution faster than any species Cale had ever fought. It was impossible. No biological neural network should have been able to decode Draythan combat signals that quickly. But it was happening, and Cale felt something he had not felt since he was a juvenile trainee in the killing pits of his homeworld. He felt fear. In the 5th second, Cale deployed all 4 arms in a simultaneous attack pattern called the Cascading Storm, a technique designed to overwhelm any single opponent by striking from 4 different angles at once, and for a fraction of a moment, he thought it would work. Marin did not try to block all 4 strikes. Instead, he stepped forward, directly into Cale's space, inside the reach of all 4 arms, and slammed his forehead into Cale's face with a force that cracked one of the assassin's secondary eye ridges and sent white-hot pain exploding through his skull. In the 6th and 7th seconds, Cale staggered back, his vision blurring in his damaged secondary eye, and Marin pressed the advantage with a series of strikes that were unlike anything Cale had ever encountered. Not martial arts, not trained technique, but something rawer and more brutal, something that targeted joints and nerve clusters and weak points in the Draythan skeletal structure that Cale did not even know were weak points. Hit him then. This human had studied Draythan anatomy, had prepared for this, had known that someone would come for him, and had made himself ready in a way that went beyond professional preparation and entered the territory of evolutionary adaptation. This was not a man defending himself. This was a predator that had been pretending to be prey. In the 8th second, Marin caught Cale's lower right arm at the elbow joint and twisted it with a controlled, devastating motion that snapped the silicon-reinforced bone with a sound like a tree branch breaking in a storm. And Kale screamed, a sound that no one on the station would hear, because Marin had soundproofed his quarters, which meant he had expected this, which meant he had been ready for weeks or months, or however long it took a human to prepare a trap this perfect. In the 9th second, Kale found himself pinned against the wall of the small room, with his own phase blade pressed against his throat, held in Marin's steady right hand, the molecular vibration of the weapon singing against the scales of his neck. And 3 of his 4 arms were useless, one broken, one pinned, one numb from a nerve strike that Kale had not even felt land. And his remaining functional arm was held in place by Marin's left hand, with that same impossible steel trap grip. That was how long it had taken an unarmed, unarmored human with no combat classification to completely and utterly defeat the most dangerous assassin in 47 star systems. The room was quiet now, except for Kale's ragged breathing and the soft hum of the phase blade at his throat. Marin stood in front of him, barely breathing hard, his brown eyes locked on Kale's amber ones, and in those eyes, Kale saw something that terrified him more than the defeat itself. There was no rage, no triumph, no excitement, no adrenaline-fueled wildness. There was only a deep, exhausted patience, the look of a man who had done this before, and was tired of it, and knew he would have to do it again. "Who sent you?" Marin asked. His voice was still calm, still low, still steady, and Kale realized with a sinking feeling that this human had not even been truly tested, that what Kale had just experienced was not Marin at his best or his worst, but somewhere in the comfortable middle, the level of effort that a human used for a problem that was annoying but not actually dangerous. Kale said nothing, because he was a Void Fang, and Void Fangs did not break, did not talk, did not surrender information under any circumstances. Marin looked at him for a long moment, and then nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer too. "That is fine," Marin said. "We have time." He reached over to the desk with his free hand, never taking the blade from Kale's throat, and pressed a button on the comm panel. "Security, this is Marin. I need a containment team to my quarters, and tell medical to prepare for a Draythin with a compound fracture of the lower right humerus." He looked back at Kale. "Also send coffee. It is going to be a long night." The containment cell they put Kale in was deep inside Helix Point's security wing, a section of the station that most residents did not even know existed, hidden behind maintenance corridors and sealed blast doors that required 3 separate authorization codes to open. The cell was designed for dangerous prisoners, energy barriers on all 4 walls, gravity dampeners in the floor that could pin an occupant flat if they became violent, and a medical system built into the ceiling that could deliver sedatives through the air, if needed. Kale sat on the narrow bench inside the cell, with 3 of his 4 arms wrapped around his torso, and the 4th, the broken one, held rigid in a medical splint that the station's doctors had applied with a professional efficiency that surprised him. They had treated him well, these Helix Point medics. They had set the bone, administered pain suppressants calibrated for Draythin biology, and even asked if he had any dietary requirements, which was so far removed from what Kale expected as a captured assassin, that he almost wondered if they were mocking him. But they were not mocking him. Being human, and he was beginning to understand that this might be the most unsettling thing about them. It had been 6 hours since the fight in Marin's quarters, and in those 6 hours, Kale had done nothing but sit in silence and replay those 9 seconds in his mind over and over and over again, trying to find the moment where he had made a mistake, the error in his technique, the gap in his preparation that had allowed a soft-bodied mammal from a nothing planet to break him like a training dummy. He could not find it. The door to the security wing opened, and Jonah Marin walked in, carrying 2 cups, one filled with the hot black poison he called coffee, and the other filled with something that smelled faintly of mineral salts and chemical compounds. Marin set the second cup at the opening slot in the energy barrier. "That is a Drathan calcium supplement drink," Marin said. "Your medics recommended it for bone healing, and the station kitchen synthesized it. It based on the formula in the Galactic Medical Database." Kale stared at the cup, but did not take it. Marin sat down in a chair on the other side of the barrier, sipped his coffee, and waited. He was very good at waiting. Kale had noticed that about him during the 3 days of surveillance, and now he understood why. This was a species trait, not a personal one, and it was perhaps the single most dangerous quality that humanity possessed. Every other species Kale had studied had a breaking point when it came to patience. The Kreth grew restless after minutes, the Valesi after hours. Even the ancient Yenthari eventually ran out of stillness and began to fidget and push and demand. Humans did not break. They sat and waited and watched with those calm, steady eyes, and they could do it for hours or days or weeks or however long it took, because their species had evolved on a world where the hunt sometimes lasted not minutes, but days, across open grasslands, under a burning sun until the prey simply collapsed from exhaustion, while the human kept walking, always walking, never stopping, never giving up. "I know you will not tell me who hired you," Marin said, after several minutes of comfortable silence. "That is fine. Void Fangs have a code, and I respect that." Kale's secondary eyes narrowed. The fact that Marin knew the term Void Fang and used it correctly was another surprise in a night that had been full of them. "But I think you are a smart being, Kale Giron," Marin continued, and Kale stiffened at the sound of his real name. His cover identity, his guild-forged documents, his flawless alias, all of it meaningless, because this human had known who he was the entire time. "I have known who you were since the day you arrived," Marin said, reading the expression on Kale's scaled face with an ease that was almost insulting. "Your cover was excellent. Truly it was one of the best I have ever seen. And I have seen many. But there is a way that Drathan assassins walk that is different from Drathan traders, and I have made it my business to learn the difference." "How?" Kale asked, and it was the first word he had spoken since his capture. Marin sipped his coffee. "Because you are not the first one who has come for me," he said simply. "Not the first Drathan. Not the first Void Fang. Not the first being who thought that humans were easy targets. And I am still here, and they are not. And at some point, I decided that it was more efficient to learn how to spot the ones who are coming, rather than wait for them to arrive in my bedroom at 3 in the morning. Kale absorbed this information with the cold, analytical mind that had made him one of the 12. And the picture that was forming was one that he did not like. "How many?" he asked. "Counting you, 7 in the past 2 years, Marin replied. 3 from the Yenthari, 2 from the Tao. Kreth Trade Federation, 1 freelance Valesi, and now you. The 2 Yenthari operatives before me," Kale said, "the ones who vanished." Marin nodded. "They are alive, both of them, relocated to a secure facility where they are providing very useful intelligence about Yenthari operations in this sector, in exchange for reduced sentences and eventual release." Kale blinked all 4 eyes at once. "You did not kill them?" "No." "Why?" Marin set his coffee cup down and looked at Kale with an expression that the assassin could not read, and Kale could read the expressions of over 40 different species. "Because killing is the easy part," Marin said. "Any species can learn to kill. The Drathan are good at it, the Kreth are good at it, even the Valesi are good at it in their sneaky little way. But turning an enemy into an asset, turning a weapon sent against you into a weapon that works for you, that requires something that most species have not figured out yet." "And what is that?" Kale asked. "Patience," Marin said, "and the understanding that the being sitting across from you is not just a threat to be eliminated, but a thinking, feeling creature, with its own reasons, and its own fears, and its own desire to survive. And that if you can find the right words, and the right moment, that creature might just decide that working with you is better than dying for whoever hired them." The room was quiet for a long time. Kale reached through the barrier slot and took the calcium supplement drink. He tasted it. It was not bad, slightly chemical but recognizable, and it reminded him distantly of the mineral pools on his homeworld, where juvenile Draythan went to strengthen their developing bones. "The Yenthari Archon who hired me," Kale said, and he felt something crack inside him. That was not a bone, but something older and harder. The code he had lived by for 30 years. The silence that a Void Fang was supposed to carry to the grave. The Archon is named Vethis Kol, and he operates from a private vessel called the Luminarch. It moves between 3 systems on a rotating schedule, and he is not just targeting you. He is building a network to undermine human influence on Helix Point, because your species is threatening the last of the Yenthari power structures in this sector. Marin listened without interrupting, his brown eyes steady, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and when Kale finished, he nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it. Kale could hear it in his voice, plain and simple and genuine. "The Archon will send more," Kale said. "Not Draythan next time. He will escalate, hire a squad, use military-grade assets, because he is desperate, and desperate beings do dangerous things." "I know," Marin said. "You are not afraid," Kale observed. Marin smiled, a small, tired, honest smile that reached his eyes. "Fear is a useful tool," he said. "It keeps you sharp, keeps you careful, keeps you alive. My species learned a long time ago that the trick is not to eliminate fear, but to keep it on a leash, to let it sharpen your senses without letting it cloud your judgment." He leaned forward slightly. "I have a question for you, Kale Giron, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer." Kale waited. "Your career as a Void Fang is over," Marin said, and his voice was not cruel, but it was honest in a way that cut deeper than cruelty. "You were defeated by a human, a species that your guild classifies as unthreatening. And when that information reaches the Assassin Guild, your rank will be stripped, your name will be removed from the active register, and you will be disgraced in a way that cannot be undone." Kale said nothing, because everything Marin said was true. "The Archon who hired you will deny the contract and leave you to whatever fate finds you, because that is what clients do when their assassins fail. They cut the thread and pretend it never existed." "Also true." "So you have a choice," Marin said. "You can sit in this cell and wait for whatever comes, or you can help me dismantle the network that used you as a disposable weapon. And in return, I will offer you something that your guild and your client never could." "Did. And what is that?" "Respect," Marin said. "Not as a tool, not as a weapon, not as a disposable asset, but as a professional who was simply outmatched by something the galaxy forgot to be afraid of." Kale looked at this human, this soft, slow, fragile creature who had caught a Void Fang's killing blow with his bare hand, and then offered his defeated enemy a cup of mineral water and a second chance. And he felt something that he had no name for in the Draythan language, something that was not quite admiration and not quite fear, but lived somewhere in the space between the two. "I will help you," Kale said. Marin nodded and stood up. "Good. I will have security move you to better quarters, and we can begin debriefing tomorrow." He paused at the door. "One more thing," Kale said. Marin turned. "In the fight, in my quarters, you were not truly at full capacity, were you?" Marin looked at him for a long moment, moved behind his eyes, something old and deep and not entirely gentle. "Get some rest, Kale," he said, and he walked out without answering the question. Which, Kale reflected as he sat alone in the quiet cell, was an answer in itself. Later that night, Marin stood in his temporary quarters, a different room from the one where the fight had happened, because maintenance needed to repair the wall damage and the broken furniture, and he composed a message. He attached a single file to the transmission, a visual recording of Kale's phase blade, broken cleanly in half, lying on a metal table under harsh light. He added a short audio clip in his own voice. "Archon Vethis Cole, I am keeping your assassin, and he has told me everything I need to know about your operations in this sector. If you would like to send another one, please do, because I could use the exercise." He sent the message through 6 different relay points to ensure it could not be intercepted, traced back to its origin. And then he sat down in the observation lounge with a fresh cup of coffee and watched the binary stars turn slowly outside the viewport. Somewhere out there, a Yenthari Archon was about to have a very bad day. Marin sipped his coffee and waited, because that was what humans did. They waited, and they watched, and they prepared. And when the darkness finally came for them, they met it head-on, with steady eyes and open hands that could just as easily offer mercy as deliver destruction. And the galaxy was only just beginning to learn what that meant. The message reached Archon Vethis Cole aboard the Luminarch at exactly the moment he was hosting a dinner for 3 Yenthari trade ministers, and the sound that came from his private communications chamber after he excused himself to read it was something that his servants would later describe as a scream that went on for much longer than seemed physically possible. Within the hour, intelligence contact the Archon possessed received the same order. Find out everything there is to know about Commander Jonah Marin and the human species' combat capabilities, and find it now. Within 2 hours, the first reports came back, and they were not encouraging. The galactic intelligence community, it turned out, had been quietly accumulating data on human military capabilities for the past 50 years, ever since the First Contact War, a conflict that had begun when a Kreth warband of 1,600 warriors raided a human colony world called New Anchorage, expecting to find farmers and scientists and easy prey, and ended 11 months later when the last surviving Kreth, 43 out of 1,600, surrendered to a human force that had been outnumbered, outgunned, and technologically inferior at the start of the war, and had won anyway through a combination of tactics so adaptive and relentless that the Kreth Military Academy still studied the campaign as an example of what happens when you fight an enemy that simply refuses to accept that it has lost. The intelligence reports contained a term that made the Archon's exoskeleton go cold: persistence predator. The term had been coined by a Drathan xenobiologist named HFY War, who had spent 20 years studying human evolutionary history. And what she had found had disturbed her so deeply that she had classified her own research and recommended that it never be published. Humans, her research showed, had evolved on a world that the galactic classification system rated as a Category 7 death world. A planet with extreme geological instability, a wildly tilting rotational axis that created violent seasonal changes, an atmosphere filled with corrosive oxygen, oceans of a universal solvent that humans casually swam in for fun, and a biosphere so aggressively competitive that nearly every living thing on the planet was either venomous, armored, clawed, fanged, or some combination of all 4. And humans, soft, slow, fragile humans, had conquered all of it, not through strength, because they were weaker than most of Earth's apex predators, not through speed, because they were slower than almost everything that hunted them, not through armor or venom or claws, because they had none of these things. They conquered through 2 traits that, when combined, produced something that HFY War described in her classified report as the most terrifying evolutionary strategy in the known galaxy. The first trait was endurance. Humans could not outrun their prey, but they could outwalk it, outjog it, outlast it, over distances that no other land predator on their world could match, pursuing wounded animals for hours and days across open terrain under a blazing sun until the animals simply fell down and could not get up again. And then the humans would walk up to it, breathing steadily, barely tired, and finish the job. Second trait was adaptability. Humans did not specialize, they generalized, which meant they could survive in any environment their death world threw at them. Deserts, tundra, jungles, oceans, mountains, swamps. And when they encountered a problem they could not solve with their bodies, they solved it with their minds, building tools and weapons and shelters, and eventually civilizations out of whatever materials were at hand. The combination of these two traits meant that humans never stopped and never gave up, and could turn anything into a weapon. And the Galactic Intelligence Community's classified assessment of humanity's military potential was a single sentence that had been circulating in whispered conversations at the highest levels of power for decades. Do not start a war with humanity. You may win the first battle, but they will win everything after that. The Archon read these reports and felt something that Yenthari Archons were not supposed to feel. Doubt. Pause. But doubt was not enough to stop him, because the Archon was desperate in the way that only a member of a fading empire could be desperate, clinging to the last scraps of power with a ferocity that increased as the power slipped away. And so he made a decision that would set events in motion far larger than a single assassination contract. He sent a new message, not to the Assassin Guild this time, but to someone much more dangerous. He sent it to the Yenthari military remnant. Meanwhile, on Helix Point, Kale Jurin was settling into his new quarters, a small but comfortable suite in the station's secure wing, guarded but not imprisoned, monitored but not caged, and he was experiencing something that he had never experienced before in his entire life as a professional killer. He was being treated with kindness. Not strategic kindness, not manipulation dressed up as generosity, but genuine, simple, human kindness. The medics checked his arm every day and called him by name. The security guards brought him food that had been specially prepared for Drathan dietary needs. And Marin himself came by every morning with 2 cups of that poisonous black drink and sat with him for an hour, talking. They talked about many things, about the Archon's network, about Yenthari intelligence operations, about the political dynamics of the sector. But they also talked about things that had nothing to do with the mission. Marin told him about Earth, about the oceans and the mountains, and the impossible variety of life that crawled and swam and flew and burrowed across every surface of that terrifying little world. He told him about human history, about the wars and the plagues and the disasters and the countless times that humanity had been pushed to the very edge of extinction and had crawled back from the brink through sheer stubborn refusal to accept that the story was over. Humans had discovered that the seeds of a particular plant, when roasted and crushed and steeped in hot water, produced a drink that tasted terrible and contained a chemical that was technically designed by the plant to kill insects. And how humanity's response to this discovery was not to avoid the poison, but to drink it every morning and build an entire culture around it. "Your species is insane," Kale said one morning, staring at his own cup of the dark liquid that Marin had convinced him to try. Marin laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded. "Yes," he agreed, "that is sort of our thing." And Kale found himself doing something that a Void Fang should never do. He smiled. 3 weeks after Kale's capture, the debriefing was complete. Kale had provided everything he knew about the Archon's network, his operating methods, his financial structures, and his political connections, and Marin had assembled a picture of the Yenthari operation that was comprehensive enough to dismantle it piece by piece. But before that work could begin, something happened that changed everything. The Galactic Assassin Guild, the ancient institution that had governed the profession of killing for 4,000 years, convened an emergency session in their hidden fortress on the ice world of Dreth Prime. The reason for the emergency was simple. For the first time in the Guild's history, a Void Fang had been defeated in the field, and the species that had defeated him was one that the Guild had never bothered to classify. The session was attended by the 11 remaining Void Fangs, 10 in person, and 1 via secure holographic link from a distant system, along with the Guild's Council of Elders, a group of ancient Drathan whose scales had faded to white with age, and whose combined kill count numbered in the thousands. Some of the Void Fangs refused to believe the report. A human could not have defeated Kale Giron. It was impossible. The data must be corrupted. The report must be a forgery designed to embarrass the guild. But others were quieter, and their silence was more frightening than the loud ones' denial. Because the quiet ones were the oldest and the most experienced, and they had heard rumors, whispers that had been circulating for decades about human combat capabilities that did not match their biological profile. One of the elders, a Draythin so old that her secondary eyes had gone milky and blind, spoke last. "I fought a human once," she said, and the chamber went absolutely silent. 60 years ago, before any of you earned your first kill. It was not a contract, it was a chance encounter on a border station, a misunderstanding that turned violent. She paused. I was faster. I struck first, and my blade was in the perfect position for a kill. The human caught my arm, and broke it before I understood what had happened. The silence in the chamber was total. I was younger then, and stronger, and I had never been touched in combat, and this human, this small, soft, slow creature, put me on the ground in less than 10 seconds, and then, and this is the part that I have never forgotten, the human helped me up, set my broken arm, and apologized for the misunderstanding. She looked around the chamber with her one good eye. I did not file a report because I did not believe what had happened to me, and I did not want to believe it, and so I buried the memory for 60 years. But I am telling you now, the report about Kale Giron is true, and this species is something that we are not prepared for. The vote that followed was unanimous. Humanity was assigned a new threat classification, Index Null, a designation that had never been used before, created specifically for this moment. The existing threat scale simply did not have a number high enough. The official recommendation was appended to every active contract database in the galaxy, in every language, in bold text that could not be missed. Do not engage, do not provoke. If contracted against a human, decline the contract. Failure to follow this recommendation may result in permanent termination of the operative. Back on Helix Point, Kale learned about the Guild's decision through a secure channel that Marin's intelligence team had intercepted, and he read the new classification with a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that the truth was finally acknowledged, sadness for the career that was over, and a strange, unexpected pride in the species that had bested him. Marin found him reading the report in the observation lounge. "You have seen it?" Marin said. It was not a question. "Index Null," Kale replied. "They created an entirely new classification for your species. That has never happened in 4,000 years. Marin sat down across from him and set a cup of coffee on the table between them. "Is that good or bad?" Marin asked. Kale looked at the human, at this unremarkable, soft-bodied, coffee-drinking creature who had caught a killing blow in the dark, and then offered his enemy a second chance. And he realized that the question itself was the most human thing he had ever heard. Because only a species that genuinely did not understand its own terrifying potential could ask it with such simple sincerity. "It means the galaxy is finally beginning to understand what you are," Kale said. Marin picked up his coffee. "And what are we?" Kale thought about this for a long time. About Earth and its oceans of acid, and its atmosphere of fire, and its endless parade of creatures designed to kill each other in increasingly creative ways. About the humans who had risen from that hellscape and conquered it. Reached for the stars. About the man sitting across from him who could break a void fang with his bare hands, and then offer that same void fang a cup of mineral water and call him by name. "You are predators who learn to be kind," Kale said finally, "and that is the most frightening thing in the galaxy, because it means that every act of gentleness is a choice. And every choice not to destroy is a decision that could go the other way at any moment. And the only thing standing between your kindness and your capacity for violence is your own will. Marin looked at him, and something moved behind those brown eyes, something old and deep, and not entirely gentle. The same thing Cale had glimpsed in the fight, the thing that lived beneath the calm surface, like a current beneath still water. "You are not wrong," Marin said quietly. They sat together in the observation lounge and watched the binary stars turn. And somewhere out in the dark, between those stars, Yenthari Archon was marshaling forces for a conflict he did not yet understand. He had already lost. Because he was thinking in terms of weapons and soldiers and firepower. And he did not understand that the most dangerous thing about humanity was not what they could destroy, but what they could endure. The galaxy was waking up, slowly and reluctantly, to a truth that would reshape everything. That the soft, slow, fragile species from the little death world had been the apex predator all along, hiding in plain sight behind smiles and handshakes, and cups of poisonous black liquid. And now that the secret was out, nothing would ever be quite the same. Marin finished his coffee and looked at Cale. "Ready to get to work?" he asked. Cale flexed his 3 functional arms and felt the splint on his 4th creak softly. "Yes," he said. And somewhere deep in his chest, in the place where the killing code had lived for 30 years, something new was growing. Something that felt like purpose, or maybe hope, or maybe just the simple, strange, terrifying warmth of being treated like a person by a species that had every reason to treat him like an enemy. He did not have a word for it in the Drathan language, but humans, he suspected, probably did.